Have you ever noticed how some people cross all your boundaries and you let them? It's not weakness, it's something deeper. What you tolerate silently shapes your soul, and the price of not saying no might be your identity. Carl Jung already warned us, what you don't face controls you. Toxic behaviors aren't obvious. They hide behind smiles, favors, and uncomfortable silences. Are you being manipulated or manipulating yourself to fit in? Today you're going to see what nobody taught you about relationships, psychological shadows, and emotional protection. Because when you understand this, you'll never again accept less than you deserve. Unacceptable behaviors aren't just external actions. They're reflections of internal imbalances. For Jung, what we allow in others mirrors what we haven't yet recognized in ourselves. Tolerating the unacceptable often reveals a passive shadow, a self that stays silent, that's afraid to set boundaries. Some people think toxic behaviors are just yelling, betrayals, or aggression. But the truth is that silence in the face of humiliation also speaks. And it speaks loudly. According to Carl Jung's psychology, what you let slide in others without realizing it is what your own psychological shadow still can't face. The person avoids conflict, but is actually avoiding themselves. Behind the passivity lies an old fear of not being loved if they dare to protect themselves. And this fear creates a cycle where the unacceptable becomes the habitual. It's at this point that emotional boundaries start melting like ice in the sun. The absence of reaction might seem like maturity, but it's often just the persona trying to maintain the facade of being an evolved person. But the unconscious isn't fooled. It registers every time someone walks all over you and collects later with interest. It's as if the soul screams for emotional control while the body just smiles, pretending everything's fine. Believe me, the worst emotional manipulation that exists is the one you practice against yourself. Once a woman told me she always gave in to her partner's requests. Even when she felt invaded, she'd say, "It's better to avoid conflict." The problem is that this avoiding made her sick. She lost her sparkle, her joy, her autonomy. When asked why she tolerated it, she answered, "Because he needs me." But that wasn't love. It was a projection of the savior archetype, inverted. And when someone lives like this without realizing it, they're already one step away from letting their soul fragment. And that's exactly where the danger reveals itself as deeper. The absence of healthy boundaries is a silent invitation to violation. Analytical psychology teaches that the self needs clear contours to differentiate itself. When everything is allowed in the name of peace, the price is identity fragmentation. What many people call being understanding might actually be the wide-open door to abusive relationships. In Carl Jung's psychology, the self, that deepest instance of the soul, needs to know where it begins and where it ends. If a person doesn't know how to say, "This hurts me," the other person might never realize they're causing harm. When the boundary between one and the other disappears, a no man's land is born, where emotional manipulation reigns. In this scenario, respect stops being mutual and becomes an occasional favor. Emotional boundaries aren't walls. They're signals. They're like traffic signs that prevent accidents. Accepting everything to avoid rejection is, in practice, a message to the world that pain is negotiable. And this comes at a price: anxiety, exhaustion, a sense of emptiness. The reason? The psyche is being invaded without resistance. The psychological shadow still believes that loving means erasing yourself. However, real love requires presence, and presence requires boundaries. In a common case, a young woman grew up accepting constant criticism from her mother because she believed it was better not to clash. The result was developing an irrational fear of taking a stand, whether in college, at work, or in relationships. The absence of visible confrontations masked a real internal chaos. The most concerning part? She believed she was doing well. It's in this kind of emotional anesthesia that the victim archetype begins to settle in, preparing the ground for the next unconscious game. Emotional manipulation is an unconscious game, both for those who do it and those who allow it. Jung would say that where there's emotional blackmail, there's a fragile persona wanting to be loved at any cost. Recognizing this is the first step to getting out of the trap. Emotional manipulation rarely enters through the front door. It slips through the cracks of neediness. It's subtle, comes with compliments, smiles, or even tears. And the most curious part? Often whoever gives in to the manipulator is also manipulating themselves. The persona, according to Carl Jung's psychology, wants to maintain the role of good person at all costs. But deep down, the soul is already screaming for emotional control. Only nobody's listening, because the fear of losing the other is greater than the fear of losing yourself. You know that phrase, "You're going to leave me now after everything I've done for you?" Well, that's not love. It's emotional debt. And the scariest part is that the person who hears this often feels guilty without having done anything wrong. In this psychic game, emotional manipulation feeds both their shadows. The controller feels power, the submissive feels value. But it's all an illusion, an unconscious exchange of poorly healed wounds, an emotional theater where nobody comes out whole. I knew a guy who bent over backwards to please his girlfriend, even when she treated him with contempt. When I asked why, he answered, "Because she needs me." What he didn't see was how trapped he was in the savior archetype. He wasn't saving anyone, he was losing himself in the process. And the more he gave in, the more she tested, the more she demanded, the more he erased himself, until the day he realized that to stay there, he'd have to erase everything he was. But does this only happen in romantic relationships? Invasive behaviors are tests for your individuation process. Every time someone crosses your boundaries, the unconscious asks, "Do you know who you are yet? And how much are you willing to protect that truth?" The world will test you. And it's not with great tragedies, it's with small gestures. Someone reads your messages without asking, decides for you, invades your time, as if they own it. These toxic behaviors are actually mirrors of your own internal instability. According to Carl Jung's psychology, the individuation process requires that you know who you are and defend that who firmly. Because the unconscious doesn't just want you to grow, it wants to know if you can handle sustaining who you're becoming. With each invasion, the unconscious sends a silent question. Do you have the courage to exist yet? Or do you still mold yourself to what others expect? The answer lies in your emotional boundaries. When you don't say, "This hurts me," life sends another similar situation until you learn. It's like the soul's pedagogical repetition system. It's not about punishment, but about learning. After all, how can you develop emotional control if everything from outside still breaks you down inside? When a person feels suffocated, like a man whose partner controlled his schedule, friendships, and even what he wore, what seemed like understanding was actually an erasure of his own self. The problem isn't just in the other's invasion, but in the absence of responsibility for oneself. Ignoring this opens space for the psychological tyrant to grow, often disguised as love. The question that remains is, how far are you willing to go to preserve yourself? Relationships that control your time, energy, and expression are disguises of the tyrant archetype. Whether in partners, family, or friends, subtle dominance reveals an unresolved battle between the ego and the self, in you and in the other. Not all control shows itself with yelling or direct orders. Sometimes it comes in the form of disguised questions. Are you going out dressed like that? Do you really need to see that person today? Seemingly innocent phrases, but ones that exact a high price, your freedom. According to Jung's archetypes, the tyrant doesn't need to raise their voice to dominate. They whisper, wait for you to give in, and gradually mold your identity. And the most dangerous part? It's when you think this is normal. When someone starts controlling your time, your energy, even your way of expressing yourself, we're no longer talking about affection. We're talking about territory. And yourself, if still fragile, begins to give up space. Because the ego wants to be accepted, wants to avoid conflict. But the unconscious notices. It registers each self-betrayal as a crack in the individuation process. And with each concession, a piece of your truth disappears. Until the day you don't even know what you feel anymore, you just react. A friend told me her partner insisted she change careers. He said it was for the good of the couple. But gradually she stopped doing what she loved, stopped going out with friends, and started asking permission even to have time alone. That's not partnership, it's emotional domination. And when you enter this dance, you need to ask yourself, who's holding the reins of my life? Because the next step is usually even more subtle and more dangerous. Constant victimization is a call for salvation, projected onto you. Jung called this unconscious identification with the savior archetype. Be careful. Helping too much can be a refined type of self-denial. When someone always positions themselves as a victim, they're unconsciously summoning a savior into their own story. This request often falls on you, who accepts carrying a weight that isn't yours. Carl Jung's psychology reveals that the savior archetype, when misunderstood, becomes a trap. Help that suffocates, care that imprisons, attention that enslaves, and emotional boundaries are lost, making room for toxic behaviors to settle in. It's common to see people who sacrifice too much, believing that true love is a kind of abdication. But actually, this might be emotional manipulation in silent mode, an invisible pact where the savior and the victimized keep each other trapped. A typical example is that friend or family member who always complains about life but refuses advice and still blames you when things don't improve. Is helping like this really protection or just an invitation to get lost? Another striking case: I knew a woman who spent years trying to save her brother from his addictions. She stopped taking care of herself, her work, her dreams, until she realized that to truly help, she first needed to protect herself. After all, self-knowledge and protection go hand in hand. Only those who know their own emotional boundaries can offer genuine support without getting lost along the way. And this discovery, without doubt, is the beginning of a new chapter. Forced silence, the fear of speaking, the feeling of walking on eggshells, these are traits of abusive psychological environments. When your voice disappears, it's a sign that the unconscious is screaming, and your soul is already running away from there. Many wonder why they stay silent even in the face of suffering. Carl Jung's psychology helps us understand that when fear dominates, the inner voice is muffled by the need to survive the conflict. Silence in this case isn't absence, but a mute cry from the psychological shadow fighting not to dissolve. Walking on eggshells isn't weakness, it's a clear sign that emotional boundaries have been violated and the soul begins to withdraw. I remember a young man who, in his relationship, avoided expressing opinions so as not to provoke fights. He described this feeling as if he were living in an invisible prison where each wrong word could cause a disaster. This invisibility of the soul can be even more destructive than explicit aggression, as it erodes self-knowledge and emotional protection. The question that remains is, how long will emotional control be a burden in the name of apparent peace? And it's precisely this absence of voice that opens space for other forms of emotional manipulation. When you don't speak, the other fills the void with whatever they want. What do you think your silence is saying to those who live with you? And more importantly, what are you saying to yourself by not asserting yourself? These questions lead directly to the next point, the poison that disguises itself as humor. Ironies disguised as humor and constant criticism are forms of unconscious domination. Jung would say, "What is said without consciousness acts like poison. The soul feels it before the mind even understands." Many people don't realize that poison can come with a smile and a joke. Ironies and criticism disguised as teasing are toxic behaviors that silently corrode the emotional terrain. These masked attacks play with emotional boundaries, undermining self-esteem and feeding the psychological shadow of those who suffer them. It's as if a double-edged sword were being wielded unconsciously, both by those who speak and those who accept. I've had a friend say she was just kidding, while her words left a trail of insecurity. The emotional manipulation there wasn't explicit, but it was present, a subtle dance between the desire to control and the fear of losing control. For Jung, these patterns reflect internal conflicts where the tyrant archetype mixes with the jester persona, creating a power game where nobody comes out unscathed. And for those who receive this type of humor, the challenge is great. How to develop enough emotional control not to be poisoned. How to recognize that behind the joke there's a boundary being crossed. This awareness, though painful, is an essential step for the next level of self-knowledge and protection to flourish. But perception doesn't always come easily. Excessive demands, control, and surveillance camouflage deep insecurities projected onto you. The other controls you to avoid dealing with their own internal chaos, and if you accept it, maybe you also fear your own chaos. It's curious how the controller is often, deep down, a prisoner of their own disordered emotions. In Carl Jung's psychology, this behavior reveals a conflict between the ego that seeks dominance and the self that cries out for freedom. Excessive control over you is actually a desperate attempt to contain their own internal chaos, a mask to hide vulnerabilities that nobody wants to face. And when you accept this, you unconsciously reinforce the cycle. Have you ever had someone who inspects your steps, your friendships, your decisions? This type of surveillance isn't just invasion, it's a mute cry for help. But if you don't draw your emotional boundaries, you risk internalizing that anxiety and getting lost along with them. After all, accepting someone else's control might be a reflection of the fear we have of looking into our own internal abyss, the chaos we don't know how to tame. A clear example is the friend who monitors your social media, complains about every response you make, and still blames you for being paranoid. They project their own insecurity onto you while you find yourself trapped in a cycle of self-surveillance and guilt. It's as if both your psychological shadows were waging a silent battle, where nobody comes out a winner, just wounded. Saying no is a spiritual act. Jung believed that true love is born when the individual learns to preserve themselves. Protecting yourself from unacceptable behaviors isn't selfishness. It's the soul's integrity in action. Saying no might seem simple, but it carries immense weight in the psyche of someone who never learned to set emotional boundaries. In Carl Jung's psychology, this word is a sacred shield, a clear signal that you're prioritizing yourself and your individuation journey. It's not rejection of the other, but a silent yes to your own soul. It's the point where love becomes genuine because it's born from authenticity, not dependency. Imagine someone who always accepted everything, trying to please, to avoid conflicts. The price? Loss of emotional control, deep exhaustion, and a psychological shadow that grows in hiding. True love for Jung isn't blind sacrifice, but balance. It's when you protect your boundaries, respect your desires, and allow the other to do the same. This integrity brings inner peace and strength to navigate life's storms. When someone finally learns to say no, something profound happens. Their relationships begin to transform. This person discovers a new level of self-knowledge and protection, understanding that no isn't rejection, but an essential gesture of self-love. It's a spiritual act that opens space for individuation to flourish, bringing balance and strength To deal with life's challenges, the question that remains is, are you willing to preserve yourself even if it displeases some people? Now that you've dived deep into the universe of toxic behaviors and emotional boundaries, here's an invitation to reflect. Which patterns are still hidden in your psychological shadow? To what extent have you protected yourself from emotional manipulation? Or have you allowed the ego and self to wage battles inside you? Remember, the true act of love begins when we learn to say no, when our integrity becomes a priority. Are you ready to take emotional control of your life, break free from abusive relationships, and walk toward individuation? Leave in the comments what moved you most in this video, which behaviors you recognized or realized you need to change. Your participation is what keeps this space alive and transformative. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue this journey of self-knowledge and protection. And to take the next step, how about watching the video that's appearing on the screen now? It'll deepen your understanding even more about how Carl Jung's psychology can revolutionize the way you relate to yourself and others. See you there.